Moog is subtractive. Okay, when people talk about the differences between the East Coast and the West Coast sounds, they often start with, oh, well, you got to understand that Moog synthesizers are subtractive. And I'll talk about what usually follows after that when we get to that. But for now, let's talk about Moog being subtractive. Okay. I have always protested this notion of describing something as a subtractive synthesizer. And I'll explain to you why. And yeah, a lot of people, there's an incredulity that goes along with me saying, yeah, let's not use subtractive. There's no such thing as subtractive synthesis. Everyone's like, what, are you insane? And I think that's fair, but it's also not fair. And I'll explain why. Okay, so we have the telharmonium in 1897 and after, up into 1906, whatever. The telharmonium was a device that was predicated on what came to be called additive synthesis, which is a process basically generated, influenced by Helmholtz, where you take a fundamental and then you add frequencies atop that fundamental in decreasing amplitude and increasing frequency. And in doing so, you create a sound out of harmonics. And we discovered that a complex waveform can be broken down into component harmonics and a fundamental. So this is the opposite process of that. So additive synthesis is the process where you add harmonics with intention to create a new timbre. Okay, so that is a very expensive form of synthesis. You need infinite oscillators, and it's a complex process. So when we were able to create oscillators that could output complex waveforms, we discovered that it would be a great idea to use filters to filter out waveforms in order to create new timbres. Now, this was super simple because unlike additive synthesis, where you needed an infinite amount of oscillators, with a process like this, you needed a single oscillator that had a harmonic-rich waveform. And then you could take out, using filters, the harmonics you didn't want, which would change the timbre. That's the magic of the filter. Of course, we tend to do a wholesale sort of filter where whole chunks of the harmonics are removed together, which is much less interesting. But here we saw the potential for taking a simple oscillator that could produce a complex waveform and carving out the harmonics from that to create other waveforms. This is magical, and this is very reasonably described, especially in reference to the other synthesis process, as subtractive. You're starting with a rich waveform, and then you're taking harmonics out. That is subtractive. And doing that is indeed subtractive synthesis. There's no two ways around it. That's fine. So when, there were a lot of different synthesizer type and synthesizer named instruments. From that point on, the Trautonium was really the spearhead of using this neon sawtooth generating oscillator to create this sort of subtractive outcome. Really fantastic. Anyway, so let's go up to Robert Moog. So Bob creates his system, but in creating his system, he creates his oscillators to generate sine waves. And why? Not just because, a sine wave's a great sound. It's actually really not. Having a sine wave in an oscillator is a great opportunity to do additive synthesis. So if you have an early Moog modular synthesizer, you've got sine wave oscillators. I once had the opportunity to use Eric Norlander's Wall of Doom synthesizer, which was made up, at least to some degree, of oscillators from 1967 and whatever. And because it had so many oscillators, I think 22 or something, I was able to use all the sine waves and actually create additive outcomes. So right off the bat, what we're talking about is the fact that Moog modulars were not designed to be just subtractive. They're also capable of additive synthesis or frequency modulation as well, although that's hard to control with analog oscillators, especially ones like the Moogs of that time. But anyway, so yes, subtractive elements existed in Moog synthesizers, but so did additive elements and etc. But you might be saying, yeah, whatever, Mark, but what about the minimoog? Okay, so let's move on to the minimoog, although, and I'll talk about this in a bit, sprinting onto the minimoog to define the Moog sound is not really very accurate because of the timeline. The minimoog came after all of the Moog modular elements. But okay, let's talk about the minimoog. Okay, so even if you have a mere even if you have a mere 3 oscillator synthesizer, you don't have to use the filter. You can create sounds using the waveforms by mixing the waveforms to create different waveforms, or even using additive principles by stacking waveforms on top of other waveforms. Although technically it's kind of a wholesale additive and not really the effective premise of additive synthesis. But anyway, yeah, you can create more complex waveforms with your 3 oscillators on the minimoog. And you can frequency modulate them in a way to create really complex waveforms. So even on the minimoog, you're not necessarily talking, you could do additive, but 3-note additives, really boring. But you're talking about a means of creating timbre that doesn't have to do with taking away harmonics. Sure, then you employ the filter, but let's say you don't employ the filter except to, go into to force the filter into self-oscillation. You're actually adding a sine wave. You're adding a wave shape. You are adding harmonics to the wave shape when you do that. So in a way, even with the subtractive filter, the wholesale subtractive filter, you can create additive outcomes. So yes, the premise of a synthesizer like the minimoog is, okay, you start off with a waveform and then you use the filter to shape it. That is subtractive in concept. But every synthesizer that has a filter is then, I guess, subtractive, right? Well, we'll talk about that in regard to Buchla here in a minute. But this is the premise. Describing subtractive synthesis it's not a very efficacious premise in the sense of there being a set of synthesizers that are just that in comparison to a set of synthesizers that are not just that, because any synthesizer, worth being a synthesizer has the ability to create outcomes where harmonics are added, even if it isn't necessarily additive synthesis. So it's a cumbersome description unless you're using it to compare against additive synthesis, which I think some would say, well, yeah, that's what's happening because Buchla is additive. We'll talk about that. The only way a synthesizer is really only subtractive, and this is still, it's not just subtractive, but you need, like, for example, a Roland SH-101. It only has 1 oscillator and it has a filter. Yeah, you're going to create a waveform with that oscillator, and then that waveform is going to go through the filter. Single oscillator synthesizers are really kind of the subtractive synthesizer because you really can't do much else. Although you can do, self-oscillation or frequency modulation, which it depends on how you're doing it and what you're bringing in to do it with. But still, even this instance where all you have is an oscillator going through a filter, there are still opportunities that sort of make it not subtractive. And maybe that's an overly specific exploration of the term, and I understand that. But again, if you're going to describe something as subtractive, what you're really saying is that on average, the paradigm it employs is one where you take a complex wave shape and you subtract harmonics out of it, which is fine. But you have to ask, Moog is subtractive in comparison to what? I'm going to tell you that Buchla is not a good choice for that. The only way you can really describe Moog as being subtractive is if you're only talking about another type of synthesizer that's only employing additive synthesis in general. Then Moog is definitely subtractive. But Moog is not overarchingly subtractive. I guess that's my point. To describe all of Moog synthesizers as subtractive is basically to describe all synthesizers as subtractive, with the exception of those that are additive or those that employ frequency modulation or some other forms of synthesis that do not follow that pattern. And that's fine, except for the fact that what you would fit into the subtractive category would be so immense. It would be most everything. And all of the ones that you would put into the other categories are relatively limited in comparison. And especially Buchla, which we will talk about. And you're probably getting tired of me saying that. Anyway, so one of the first misconceptions about the differences between Moog and Buchla, East Coast and West Coast, is that, in this paradigm, Moog is subtractive. But that's not an effective distinction because Moog is not subtractive and Buchla employs subtractive synthesis principles. And Moog can do additive principles, and there are opportunities for Buchla to do additive as well. So it's not an effective distinction, and it's extremely misleading.